All right, cool, cool. So we'll welcome Ian. One thing I wanted to say, like at the top, was like this is so the students are all freshmen, sophomore athletes, soccer players, rowers, and basketball players. And we have a whole bunch of like really cool people coming to talk to us, and from the business financial world. And so, we have like all kinds of impressive bankers and private equity investors and consultants and all kinds of things. But like you did like something way cooler, which is like you build a business, like which to me is like I don't know. It's just a lot of these other folks will have a lot of interesting things to say and will have done lots of cool stuff. But as far as like actually creating value in the world and like employing people and like producing an actual product, like hats off, man. Like that's like that to me is like what it's all about. So with that as like an intro, I like to kind of start big and then go back to the beginning. So like let's just start at the biggest. So like what are you most proud of in your career?
Oh, Tom, you got me embarrassed a little bit already. Fortunately, I think when you've got a consumer brand, right, things seem bigger than they are. So we'll reset things a little bit with that. Looking back over life, I think that for me, where I'm most proud is that in a series of different sort of chapters or periods in my life, I've always gone all in. And I think in some ways that started, as a young kid ski racing. It certainly existed during a cycling career. But I think that's also how Scratch ultimately happened, and I think in some ways how we've had our own version of success.
And so like what at this point when you look back, like what were your kind of strengths and weaknesses and how did those play out over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously a strength in that idea of being able to go all in. I've been able to really sort of funnel and direct kind of a tunnel focus where I kind of set my eyes on one thing, on one goal, ignored pretty much everything else that was happening, which sometimes has collateral damage, right? That's not always a good thing. I think as I've grown into leading teams and working with people more directly, I would say being honest and direct with folks has been a huge strength, but it also comes with weakness, right? Where when I'm at my worst, I can come across as a jerk. When I'm at my best, that kind of direct, honest feedback, helps push people to be their best. I would say the other pieces have always been really decisive, and I don't know why. But I think again, sort of positive and negatives at its best, that allows me to move forward quickly, create a lot of clarity about what we're trying to do, what we're not doing, but then obviously at its worst, you have enormous blind spots. You may be closed off to different input. And with that, right, you can move forward in the wrong way.
So just, just to level set, I know it probably has evolved over time, but like at this point, what does Scratch Labs stand for, the brand?
Yeah, I mean, at its simplest, right, the essence, the reason we exist, is to help people be better. Um, Currently, that's around solving sports nutrition problems. And we've got a lot of room to grow there. We've got a lot of goals to have a bigger impact. But I think at its core, if the company ever pivots or grows or expands, I expect that it'll be around that idea of helping people be better.
Okay, so now I'd like to kind of go back to the beginning. And so just to level set on how we know each other,
Yeah.
Mikey, who is going to come on here later, a later week, and I put together this market research report on the trail running market because we felt like
Yeah.
people needed to know what the hell was going on and to just help the ecosystem basically. And you were kind enough to like get excited about it, and like I have a huge box of your product back there that you sent me. So I really appreciate that. So that's how we know each other through that effort.
Yeah,
So
and
just
I would
go ahead.
let me add something. I think, at least in the world we come from, right, in CPG, there's sort of like these extremes, right? You can find this crazy consumer research out there from the big consulting firms and from people who are beyond smart, who do an amazing job, but oftentimes they sort of miss the niche that, a business like ours exists in, or customers like I exist in. And I don't know exactly offhand how I found that research that you and Mikey had done, but man, when I saw it, I did get excited. I lit up about it. And I just reached out, sent you guys an email to say thank you. And it was as simple as that because it had a genuine impact not only for our business, but I think for an industry and a community that we love. And I don't know. I think the simple acts of appreciation are really important. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. No, as you know, like I'm a ultra running enthusiast. So Mikey and I just felt like the data wasn't out there, and in the data, I mean, it was completely objective. Your brand came to the top, so there it is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That always feels good too.
So in our exchange before, you were talking about how I think you said you were a blue collar kid who was good at math. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
it is. It
And
is.
that
Yeah.
and you didn't do all that well in high school, but you did well on standardized tests, and so then you ended up
Mhm.
at Colorado School of Mines because it was the best school you could get into in Colorado. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty simple.
And so then, like, I think the jumping off point that I think is like super interesting is that after one semester of college, you dropped out to go ride bikes.
Yeah.
How
Yep.
did
Yep.
that
Yep.
happen? How did that happen?
Yeah, so I don't need to get too long-winded on this, but to go backwards briefly. So, when I was ten years old, my mom suffered a closed head injury. And what had been obviously an incredibly important person in my life, right? My relationship with my mother, she had over about 2.5, 3 years had to stop working and literally had to relearn how to live. She had trouble walking, she had trouble talking, and all of those skills had to be redeveloped. And I only know this now and with a lot of therapy, but when I look back in it, that moment, that right extreme scenario sort of drove me right to this sort of functional solution that I came up with, which was to become grossly, exceedingly independent. And in that, I fell in love with alpine ski racing. And you can't totally see it on this video, but I'm not very big. And so while I put my heart and soul into it, I wasn't very good. And yet, at the same time, as I have seen so often in life, right, one path leads us to another. That led me to find the sport of cycling. And so that summer between sort of giving up on my dream of being an alpine ski racer and starting college, I fell into cycling and road bike racing in particular. And in kind of the opposite way, I don't know that I had an immediate passion for it, but I was really good at it right away. And after racing during that summer, had some good results. And as I started college that fall, was fortunate to get an opportunity to race for a team sort of at a national level that was going to pay me a stipend and give me all the equipment. And, at the time I was like, oh my gosh, I made it. Like I'm a big deal. But I kind of didn't know what to do. And I found this professor who I knew at School of Mines, who was a fan of cycling, and his name is John Berger. And I walked into John's office during his office hours, and I asked him for help. And John very succinctly looked at me, and he was like, "Look, this is an opportunity that doesn't come along. I better not see you this spring semester." And that was it. Talk about going all in. I just decided, without having very good information, that that's what I was going to do. And that was the beginning of a very fortunate but not super long career over the next, at that point, 7, 8 years, where I was fortunate to travel the world, pay my bills, buy a house, pay the mortgage, as a professional cyclist.
Yeah, so guys, just so you have background, so Ian won the national under 23 championship twice and was a European pro bike rider for 6 years. So who are you riding for in Europe?
Yeah, so the biggest team is now known as EF, and the team names kind of change around, unlike say we're used to in NFL, MLB, et cetera. But it was Garmin Cervelo was the biggest team I ever raced with, and then I raced with another team that is now known as Novo Nordisk, which has a really unique angle in that they support Type 1 diabetic athletes racing professionally. But back when
Cool.
I raced with them, it was a mix of normal athletes and Type 1 diabetics.
So I'm also a road biker, and I could spend the rest of the interview talking about that, but I won't. So like, what caused you to stop professional bike riding?
Yeah, so I was like 26 or so, maybe 27 in that time frame. And over the previous sort of 18 months, had these sort of intermittent symptoms, and it's hard to nail down. I think that when you're an athlete, right, at a top level, it's kind of amazing. We think of athletes as just incredibly strong and resilient, and I think they are, but they're also super fragile. And I think. There were these symptoms that were happening that I was really struggling to figure out what was going on. And the short version here is that essentially my iliac artery, which is the main artery that goes down and feeds the blood into your legs, started kinking almost the way a garden hose would kink. That's not the medical terminology, but if you think about it intuitively, that's what's happening. It's called iliac endofibrosis. It happens to rowers and it happens to cyclists. Again, the way I would describe it is it's a little bit like a fatigue failure from an engineering perspective. And ultimately, it left me with about 60% blood flow in my left leg. And, with that, I had to make a decision. I was either going to have vascular surgery at 26, 27, something like that. Or that was the end of my cycling career. And, my immediate reaction was, I'm having surgery, duh. I mean, this is who I am. This is how I pay my bills. This is my identity. Why wouldn't I do this? Um, and it was a tough period of time in my life, and I don't want to overstate it because obviously these are definitely first world problems, if you will. But it was tough. It was tough to make those choices, but I was fortunate to have good mentors around me and good support who were able to help me see and recognize that I wasn't just a cyclist, and that major vascular surgery in your 20s was probably, at least for me, not a great idea. Right? Vascular surgery to somebody in their 70s is one thing, but we don't know what happens 50 years later. And it's very likely, as I was getting feedback from experts, that I would develop a real medical condition, and ultimately decided that that was the end, and that I wasn't going to have that surgery, which sparked its own challenge. I certainly remember struggling. With the decision, struggling with identity. I certainly was depressed for a period of months and had to get some help and support. Again, relatively speaking, not the end of the world, but certainly a tough period for me personally.
So you go back to college at 26 or 27 or whatever.
Yeah.
What was that
Yeah.
like?
You know, in some ways, it was the big humble pie to the face. I went from thinking I was cool, right? This will date myself, but you see yourself in magazines, and you certainly have that, big fish, small pond type thing going on. And here I was right back to, an undergraduate, just another person at school. But my wife and I, we had to get a roommate to help pay our mortgage. The other side of it, though, is that for me, the second time around, I was ready and prepared, and that was the right time for me to go to school. You mentioned that I didn't have great grades in high school, and that's true. It's because I just didn't care. I was way more focused on being, the best skier I could be. And that first semester I had in college, like all I wanted to do was ride my bike and train. I didn't want to be there, but I threw myself into it. The second time around, and it was really enjoyable, actually. I certainly was an outsider in that I wasn't in the same place in life as probably most of my peers, but I did develop some close friendships with a few students, with a few professors, and also, the other place I found a lot of community was with students who had come out of the military. Were often in their late 20s, early 30s, and in a similar place in life, and so there's a lot of connection and support there as well.
Cool. So let's skip ahead. So how did Scratch Labs get started?
Yeah. So if you go backwards now again, so when I was a pro cyclist, kind of 2006, 7 timeframe, when I was racing with the Garmin Cervelo team, my now business partner, Alan Lim, was working for that same team on the staff. And Alan was the sports science director for the team. And if you go even further back, Alan and I actually met when he was doing his PhD at CU in Boulder, and I was still a ski racer in high school and was a test subject for the research that he was doing as part of his thesis. So we had an odd, lucky happenstance connection for multiple years. But Alan's job was to help us cyclists, right? Myself and my teammates go as fast as possible. And while so much of athletic performance is about these marginal gains, right? You think about aerodynamics in a wind tunnel, you think about, lighter wheels or lighter pedals or, all of these sort of technology gains. The reality is that I and most of my teammates were in our 20s and 30s. We were living in a foreign country where we didn't speak the language. We were traveling constantly. We were away from our own families and support system. And so the bottlenecks to our performance were actually where a lot of the upside was. So it wasn't necessarily breaking down, the grams of different types of amino acids that one needed to consume after a training ride. It was more literally handing us a recipe that said, here, make this. And that overall process really helped us perform better. With that, one of the things that we complained all the time about was the sports nutrition products we had, right? They made us sick. They didn't taste good. And I think back to the idea that pro athletes are paradoxically fragile. I think, they're a little bit like a canary in a coal mine. So if any of us right now today, consume a liter or two of something that's not great for us, we'll probably be okay, right? But if you think about consuming that same volume and doing it every hour, doing it 6 or 7 hours a day, 10 days in a row during the stage race, suddenly, right, you become a lot more susceptible to maybe some of the, toxins or impurities that exist in that product. And so what happened was Alan started trying to make his own stuff. And Alan's Chinese. And so he brought a different sort of culture to the Pro Peloton. And some of that was literally making these like onigiri sushi style rice cakes for us to eat instead of energy bars. But some of that were boiled potatoes, like we did at the Tour Island one year, where actually one of my teammates won the race. But a big part of that was also basically making his own sports drink. And it didn't happen overnight, but over the course of a couple of years, its formula developed to the place that that's all we wanted. And it was markedly better than what we were using. And then there became this funny story that happened, which was that we were sponsored by this company who was paying money, right, to have their logo on our jerseys, to use their water bottles. And yet, what was inside those water bottles was what we jokingly called secret drink mix. Which was this stuff that Alan was making, 1 pound at a time, literally using a KitchenAid mixer. So now, if we flash forward back to when I was, retiring and struggling with my leg injury, Alan and I reconnected and started working together on some other projects. But what kept happening was, my former teammates, right, his former colleagues kept asking, and they're like, "Hey, man, can I get some more of that drink mix?" And at first, we were like, "Hell no! Like, I don't want to make it for you. It's a pain in the ass." And they're like, "Well, hey, I'll buy some," right? And remember, I was the poor college kid again. I'm like, "Okay, I guess we'll make you some." And I mean, no joke. We started making this stuff using 5-gallon paint buckets and putting it in the paint shaker at the local hardware store. And in 2010, a batch of that stuff got shipped off to the Tour de France. And that's what the riders were using. And so, in some ways, it was this happy, lucky accident that dragged us into business, just because our friends and colleagues happened to be some of the best athletes in the world, and they were asking for what we were making.
And so, did you or did you not understand what a gross margin was when you started making this shit?
I definitely did not. I think, yeah, a totally true story. So, a quick aside, the very first time when we had started this business, we sat down with the buyers from Whole Foods Market, right? Which is in some ways like a marquee retailer, right? One that you really want to be involved with. And the buyer there was asking us about gross margins, and I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. But I will say that intuitively, the idea of this sports nutrition company made sense to us. I could certainly see how we're able to, um, create a product and sell that product, and there would be a gap, right? Which is what we now know is gross margin.
So, when you first started the business, you like got some friends and family around, and they like just threw in some money, but there was no contract or anything.
Yeah, correct. Again, I think, we were reluctant entrepreneurs. It wasn't a world or language or an idea that I personally had ever really been exposed to. Um, and, the idea of like raising money and some of those things like that was all completely foreign. And in some ways, I think that ignorance was potentially a good thing because it allowed us to look at the business, and just sort of intuit our way through it as opposed to following a path or a plan. So yeah, I mean, we had this very simple idea, which was that we got this thing called a bank. We put a little bit of money in it that we begged from our friends and family and ourselves. And we used that money to buy our first, 100 pounds of product. We sold that 100 pounds for a little more than we paid for it. And then we took that money and put it back in the bank and repeated the cycle. And that was kind of it. I mean, it was very much and again, these are all words I didn't know then, but I know now, right? A sales funded business, bootstrapped, whatever you want to call it. Tom, we certainly did not have a subscription agreement or a safe agreement or these other legal structures. Again, I didn't know what any of that was back then.
As I said at the top, this is all very refreshing from like the other people are going to come talk at this class. But anyhow, so fast forward like 3 years. So you're scrambling around for
Yeah.
3 years. You're like at 5 million or plus or minus of revenue.
hmm
And at that point, um, I saw you said somewhere else that you realized you needed to grow as a person and a leader. And you discovered this organization, EO. What's that all about?
Yeah, so I think maybe quick first some context. I mean, the business, in some ways took off. Now it's all relative, right? I mean, it wasn't open AI, right? And that's a whole new definition of taking off. But in our world, it took off, and it was absolute chaos. And it was so much scrambling, and the amount of learning that I had during that time was amazing. It was wonderful, but it was also really hard. And I think to what you alluded to right after those first few years, I definitely realized that I needed to grow my own skill set. I needed to grow and develop personally, professionally, in order to keep up with the business. And as part of that search and asking for help, yeah, I found this organization called EO, Entrepreneurs Organization, which basically creates these peer-to-peer support groups, if you will, where non-competing business owners get together and talk about their problems. And I found enormous value in that organization, enormous value.
And so then I'm just kind of trying to fast forward through the company history, but
Yeah.
after another bunch of years, excuse me, you doubled again. You're an eight-figure business, and you started using Traction EOS. What's that all about?
Yeah, so I think those actually kind of came more or less at the same time. Through EO,
Oh,
I learned about
I would
this
say,
this yeah, there's a book
okay,
called Traction, and sort of an operating structure known as EOS. And
okay.
yeah, I mean it's basically a playbook for how to help run a small entrepreneurial business. And man, a huge shout out to Gino Wickman, who's the author of that. They're not all his ideas, but he put them together.
So how did you, from all that, end up at Sloan, which for the students is the business school at MIT?
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways, it's the same cycle, right? The business doubled or tripled. I don't remember exactly, right, over those next 3, 4 years, and I found myself very fortunately recognizing that in some ways, I don't mean this arrogantly, but like had outgrown EO, and that a lot of those businesses are in that sort of like 5 to 10-ish million dollar range, and our business is well past that. And I went looking for the next catalyst and support for my own growth so that I could, continue helping, right? We've got a great team, but helping run the business. And it's funny because I think, at the front side of the exploration, I was like, I'm going to go hire a fancy executive coach and they're going to support me and it'll be half therapy and half coaching and blah, blah, blah. But I also, in being pushed and challenged, wanted to look at formal education programs. And once again, the way things work, I met a professor named Nelson Rapinning at MIT Sloan. And Nelson had some great advice for me. He said, look, we do these preview days, apply to be able to come to one of them, show up, and you'll know. You'll know if this is right for you or not. And within an hour and a half of being there at that preview day, I remember texting my wife and my business partner Alan and saying, I don't know if I can get in, but like I'm going here. I'm going to make this happen. And that's what I did. I mean, it was stressful. The application was hard. I certainly struggled with imposter syndrome and wasn't sure if I, qualified. Not something I ever thought that I would, sort of be at that place or that scale in life. Where I had grown up and et cetera. But man, it was fun. It was one of the best, most fun, most enlightening periods of my life. And it's funny because in some ways, I did it backwards, right? Built the business first and had a big team that could help run things while I was able to sort of step to the side. And certainly there were some things that we learned in the fundamentals of that I think I had learned well in building an actual business. But gosh, there was a lot of stuff that I didn't even have a clue about. So I don't know, this idea of like, I'm going to get my own MBA from building a business or, poo-poo on business school or business school is the only path. I don't know. I think that's too extreme. I think in some ways, there's huge value in both.
Yeah, one of the things I just as an aside, and I'm going to run through as many of the questions I have left, but just for the students, like one of the things that I just love about your story is that like um, there's all these times where you ask for help, and like you're just so humble in like your ability to see like what you don't know or you can't do by yourself, and like that's so instructive because I think we think that like we're Superman, and the reality is that's bullshit. Like the people who succeed are the people who are like help me.
Yeah, it's funny. I think this is worth digging on for a second. One of the things I struggled with in athletics was that in pro cycling, you're on a team, but it's still an individual sport. And I remember many times, multiple years, being homesick and lonely, in the apartment I was living at in Spain. Um, in September, not knowing if I had a contract for the following year and going to races with teammates where some of the folks there had contracts and some didn't. And sort of knowing that, there were three or four of us who were competing for maybe only one or two spots on the team the following year. And so, are you supposed to support your teammates or compete against them? And I think what's been really refreshing about the business world, and particularly the community, Boulder, Denver, and I know if that's true, actually. Spend enough time elsewhere now. Business in general is really supportive and collaborative, and you can ask for help, and you'd be amazed at people who might see you as a competitor who are willing to support you. And I think that that's a really beautiful and wonderful thing. And it certainly did not exist in my experience with pro sports.
Yeah, I would say that my experience in business is that the ecosystems that I like to live are those ecosystems, and they're not all that way, but there's certainly a
Yeah.
lot. I'm
Mhm.
very familiar. We're going to talk later in the course about the search fund ecosystem, which is where we support young guys to go out and
Yep.
guys and women who go out and buy and run businesses. And like there is so much like just a culture of collaboration in that
Mhm.
ecosystem, which is part of what I love about it.
Yep. Yeah, agreed. And
So
it's you just have to ask, right? You just got to put yourself
yeah.
out there.
Yeah. So just a few more questions, then we'll get the students going. So what's your vision? What's your goal for your company going forward?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, we've got a really well-defined, I think it's about 30,000 word written vision that we share with our entire company. And to be clear, it's what the future is going to look like. It's not how we're going to get there. And when we can paint clarity or define that picture clearly for the whole team, the whole company, then it's up to all of the employees, all of us, all of our teammates to make that vision happen. So we've got that, but that's also not something that we share publicly, right? At its simplest, right? I think we're pushing to have a larger impact. And at the same time, we've got a real commitment that we're playing our own race. We're not looking to grow and sell this business and have a big exit. Like that's not success. That's not the path to having a big impact for us. It's about helping athletes, while also recognizing that at some point in the future, right? If we do want to help people be better, there may be some pivots that come down the pipeline.
So you've been named like the best place to work by Outside, and Second Nature named you the Brain of the Year. How do you build a culture of success and love at work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of different ways to answer that question. And I think I've seen different examples of businesses that clearly have very well-defined cultures that work for them that I wouldn't want to be part of. And so, at its simplest, I think that company culture is an agreement, right? That's based on a belief set. And ultimately those beliefs then drive behaviors. And, for us at Scratch, we've got those written down and defined. We call them core values, which I think feels a little icky sometimes. And there's lots of examples in business of companies that had core values that were total bullshit. But for us, they're real, and every employee gets graded on their behavior every quarter, myself included. We're very clear that the definition of these core values is not a good person or a bad person. In fact, I tell people often, that my own father, who I love dearly, couldn't work at our company because he doesn't match those expected behaviors. And that once you've got that as a foundation, right, we can define fit. And I think another sort of addendum to that, it's important to understand that those values did not come from myself or from Alan or for us on a whiteboard. They came from within the company, and they came from us going through a literal workshop of asking ourselves, who have we been when we've been at our best? And conversely, who have we been when we've been at our worst? And the momentum that exists with that culture and that shared set of behaviors, goes well beyond myself. And I think that's the beautiful thing.
Just, I mean, I could dig in on the business a lot too, but let me just a couple more. So, on how do you think about marketing, sponsoring events, sponsoring athletes? I mean, if you believe your product is good, how do you get the word out about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all of those. And if I zoom out or think about how we look at marketing as a whole, it's a combination. It's not just going to be, say, digital demand driving, revenue driving marketing that might exist in paid media or like a Meta, TikTok, etc. Nor is it just going to be field marketing where you're physically giving out products, or brand marketing where you're sponsoring athletes or teams, or developing content, videos, etc. I mean, I think we see all of that holistically and think it all has a place. So for us, it's about trying to touch our customers or our potential customers, right, in each of those ways multiple times. Certainly with a consumable product, and one where taste is such a big part, it's enormously effective for us to show up at events, right, when somebody's in a time of need, and hand them something. And so often, right, I mean, I see it. I was at the Boulder just last week. We handed out, I think, 20,000 samples, and like you can see people's reaction instantly. Now, of course, not all of those 20,000 people are going to remember, right, Stretch in that exact moment because they're being inundated with other things. But that's a piece of the puzzle.
So, what's one mistake that you've made in your career that really sticks out?
Yeah, I mean, I've made so many mistakes. I think in some ways, they happen. They're going to happen again in the future, and right, the goal is to make sure that they're not big enough that they sink everything. Um, Sort of holistically, though, I think the biggest, or one of the biggest mistakes I made is in those first few years, the chaos that we spoke briefly about earlier, which of course I have a picture in my mind of. I loved it. It was really fun. Um, what I failed to recognize, what I failed to realize was that, in order to serve our customers, in order to push towards our goals, to move things forward, we had to bring new teammates in. And a lot of those teammates, most of those teammates didn't love that chaos. And they were begging and asking for structure, right? And whether that structure was in the form of an org chart, defined roles and responsibilities, whatever it was, they were asking for that stuff. And I ignored them, because I loved the chaos. Um, and what I've realized is that both can exist, and that there are certain roles where definition and clarity are incredibly important. And there are other roles where it's about creativity and, thinking outside the box, blah, blah, blah. And, there's a weird paradox with systems and process, which is that if you put them and create them well, they actually allow you to work outside the boundaries of those systems or those processes. And I think that's a really cool learning that I've had, right, over the subsequent years.
All right, last question, then we actually have people queuing up with questions from the students. But so, if you had to give these guys advice, how could you condense it down? So these guys are freshmen, sophomores in college, athletes trying to figure out what they're going to do in business.
Yeah, yeah. I have maybe two things I'll share. One, back to the very, very beginning. And I'm probably biased and I see my own path as like the right path. That's not the case. But I certainly do believe in this idea of going all in. I do believe in this is where I'm going. All the chips are on the table, and I'm going to almost remove the option of failing, right? Because I've got nothing else going on. That certainly works for me. It matches my own personality. And it may apply for some people. I understand that it may not work for everyone. The other piece, though, that is not cliche, but is very real, and I would just say to everyone here, and I really do mean this: trust yourself. You know what you want to do. You have an idea of how to do it. There's not people out there who know something more than you don't. Like that. It doesn't matter. And I'll share one quick story that maybe connects the dot on that, or connects the dots on that. When we first were starting Scratch, and literally knew nothing, one of the pieces of advice we were getting, right, as we were asking for help, was like we needed to have a financial model, and we spent $5,000 or $6,000 and got back this financial model from somebody who I saw as an expert who knew all these things we didn't. And I don't mean to be critical of it, but what I got back was a spreadsheet that sucked. And it was a spreadsheet that I, as an engineer, could have made much better, much faster, right? I knew more about the business already, even though I wasn't aware of it. But I was just afraid because I didn't know the lingo. I didn't know the jargon. Things like cost of goods, et cetera, felt intimidating. So there certainly is a balance, right, of asking for help and getting input from others. But man, I wish I had just trusted my own self, my own skills. And that was $5,000, could have been used in a lot better ways back then.
Cool. So we're going to run through as many students as we can get to, and then we'll make sure I have a couple last questions that I'll ask, like six or seven of, so you're out on time.
Yeah, really, really good question. So you said a word in there that for me has important meaning. How? When I think how, I think we are making strategic choices about exactly how we're going to get somewhere. Whereas when I think about a vision, it needs to be far enough out. This is my opinion, right? Far enough out that you can't address how. And if you start putting together how, you got to go further. Two tools I would point you towards. So tool one is there's this restaurant group of all things out of Michigan called Zingerman's, and the yellow book that they have has a literal recipe for how to write a vision. I use it in my life. I use it in my business. I use it with my 10-year-old daughter. It's amazing. The other one I would point you towards is there's an author named Ben Hardy, who I'm gonna get this wrong, but he basically has this, like, 10x is easier than 2x. And the idea is that if your goal is not big enough, you get stuck in the current paradigm. So that's the same idea between like making this far enough out that you're not you don't have clarity on what to do yet. And that's,
Yeah.
I think, an important mechanism.
Cool.
So yeah, every 5 or 8 years, we'll make a new one.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So yeah, I was 26, 27, which is kind of like the very beginning of sort of that peak, probably 4 to 5 year period, typically in pro cycling. Um, this is funny. This is even hard for me to admit, gosh, what, 15 years later. Um, I look back at that experience and that, thing that happened to me almost like a bad country song where you talk about unanswered prayers. I was really good at pedaling a bicycle. It was a path where I felt cool, where I had a great identity, and where, I could pay my bills. Um, I didn't love it. And in some ways, it took me probably 3 or 4 years, but I kind of had this aha where I went, oh my gosh, I'm 4 or 5 years into starting what was then Scratch, and I'm a whole lot more engaged in my life as a whole. And so when that iliac endofibrosis happened, I felt like a victim. I felt bad, felt angry. Um, I'm feel lucky that it happened.
Yeah, I think I can definitely relate to that, and I'll certainly share in subsequent classes about some of the turning points in my life. But certainly, the worst things that ever happened to me were the best
Mhm.
in terms of breaking that paradigm and opening up, all kinds of opportunities that if that hadn't happened, would not have come my way. So, more to be said on that for sure. But great answer.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, for me personally, the hardest decisions have always been around people. and the messy side of working with people, which is moving on from working with people. And there's a couple that I experienced that I've had over the years where I had to fire somebody who I had enormous respect for, and that's really hard. The other thing that happens in a growing, scaling company is that the people who get you from here to here oftentimes are not the people to get you from that next one to the next one. And so that's tough. It's tough to identify that stuff. It's tough to recognize those changes. But more specifically on decision making, Joe, I think something I coach our whole company on is making decisions when we get to the right level of information. So this is not original thought by me, right? So don't ascribe this to me. Actually, I think this one comes from Daniel Pink, of all people, who's an author. But thinking about decisions in basically three quick buckets. So the first bucket is a hat decision. I can put it on, I can take it off. If I don't like it, no big deal. Okay. The next one is a haircut, right? I can get that haircut. If I don't like it or it's really bad or my wife makes fun of me, it's okay. It'll change in 4 or 6 weeks. No big deal. And then the last one would be a tattoo. And I think if you first figure out what type of decision you're making, you can then, figure out how much attention and time and energy it needs. Don't think about hats, just put them on. Um, Maybe slow down before you get that tattoo.
Awesome. Thank you.
Good.
Braveheart. And
Nice.
yeah, weird, a lot of belief, a lot of emotion, and right or wrong, there's a fair amount of action and violence. Plus the
Uh,
MacGregors are in it, so I can feel good
there you
about
go.
that. I like breaking rules, so I'm going to put some hyphens in here. Believe or leave, i.e., believe in yourself, or go find something else where you can.
Hey man, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. And it's really an inspiring story. So keep going, man. We'll be right
Yeah,
behind you. And
thank you all.
I'm gonna keep using your product. So
Right on. Hey, real
all right.
quick, for everyone who's on here, if it's even remotely in your like, take a moment, find me on LinkedIn, make sure you find Tom if you haven't already, and then at some point ask for help, right? I may not have the answer, but like, so not literally me, but just like create that habit. It will pay off. So cool,
Believe me, they're gonna do that. I'll make sure.
cool. All
All
right.
right, man. Good luck. Talk
See
to
you
you.
guys.
All
Thank
right.
Thanks.
All
you.
right. Bye.